I assigned the two readings, but I would like to continue with last week's the sociopathology of May of '68, but go into the next chapter, which again, chapter 2, the automation of the superego, is very important for Stiegler's rewriting, if you will, of not only Freud, but really his polemic, long and I think very engaging polemic with Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, a book that I certainly was somewhat raised on, and I'm very impressed with Stiegler's reading of it. The other part, the passage of desire as original diversion of libidinal energy. And some of the points that he makes there. I think this is very important for an understanding of Stiegler's notion of, again, technics as this third term between collective and psychic and collective individuation. That this third term is always there. And I think he explicates it pretty well here in this chapter 2 of the lost spirit of capitalism. Also, we can go to cinematic consciousness, but also continue next week. And then I have some sections in Kittler, which I'd really like us to read. Kittler has a completely different approach to a lot of this in his book, Optical Media. But to me, these are the two leading, post 68 thinkers, if you will, on these questions of, technology, time, and where we are. And, Kittler's amazing in his knowledge of invention and et cetera. And I think you'll see a lot of very good stuff. For those of you here last week, I know I mentioned, and let me just look in I think I put it in some notes I have, this Godard piece. I found where it was. It's called Genesis of a Camera. And for people that are interested in this, Genesis of a Camera, it was volume 5, numbers 13 and 14 of Camera Obscura. And it was on the development of the 35 Aeroflex and then the 8-tone 35 millimeter camera. And it was a long discussion with Jean-Pierre Bouvier, I think it was Boviala, who was both a maker of designer and a maker of the camera. So this is a very interesting discussion in Camera Obscura to see this optical media being developed, et cetera. Yeah.
That's volume 5, Michael?
Yeah, volume 5, numbers 13 and 14 of Camera Obscura. I think if I'm not mistaken, it was the late 80s or early 90s. Yeah, when this was out. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's, on this thing, and Godard has some very interesting comments about the hand extension, the extension of the hand. And, we'll sort of, I want to go back to that with Heidegger later, in terms of some of the things about this, where Stiegler seems to, maybe fall short, but we can talk about this, in a couple of weeks. So I guess, is everybody okay? I mean, I don't want to bore you to death to go about 2 or 3 more weeks and then we'll stop for a while. Is that okay? Yeah. I put it out till the end of January, whatever. Today's the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th at least. And yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, good. All right, good. Okay, so again, and I want to mention another thing. I know I said this at the beginning of the semester, but or the beginning of the class, that Stiegler's daughter, since he brings up this term adoption a lot, she has a book out, Is It Necessary to Adapt? Which is a kind of summary of Lippmann, Dewey, and Bernays and others in the American context. It's a kind of view of American pragmatism that's very interesting in terms of the social democratic impulse, if you will, somewhat of American pragmatism. And she's interesting in this sense. I don't think there's a whole lot of new stuff there, but anyway, we'll see. Yeah.
That is,
yeah.
That's what, of course, that's what the main term that the Lacanians objected to in American psychoanalysis.
Yes.
Was adaptation. This was
yes.
his the thing he hated most.
Yes.
Was this idea that one should change, one should adapt to one's environment rather than,
Right.
changing.
Absolutely. Made in USA psychology.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that, yes, right. Mhm. Always strengthen the ego so it can cope better under the circumstances.
Right, right. Yeah.
Right, and adapt well. And as we all know, the neo-Freudians were very good at figuring out this adaptation in their clinical work. And you can see this play out in Hollywood, of course. Yeah, right after, the Horney, Sullivan, this moment in American psychoanalysis. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then Fenichel and others are relegated to the other. I don't know if you know this, but Janice Rule became the actress who was very good in many parts, especially in The Swimmer, which is kind of like a psychoanalytic session with Burt Lancaster. If you've seen that movie, it's taken from the John Cheever story about the guy who's completely alienated and he starts swimming from pool to pool in the suburbs and going. And it's a pretty amazing film in retrospect and all of this. But anyway,
Swimmer? Did you say?
Swimmer, yeah. Do you know it? Yeah. Burt Lancaster, yeah, he's great in it, but she kind of steals the show in many ways. Her performance about a 16-minute confrontation with Lancaster, the swimmer. They were ex-lovers, and she's excellent in this. But she actually became a practicing psychoanalyst and came out of the Otto Fenichel school. Who was basically not a reactionary made in USA ego psychologist in many ways. He had the round, and this was a very interesting moment on the West Coast, especially LA. She went to LA. She ended up back in New York. She was married to Ben Gazzara for a long period. Yeah, so very interesting figure, kind of forgotten as a very highly intelligent, actress, right? Who played intelligent parts, as well. She was cast well many times. It was not like the Monroe, who was very, very, smart, but always cast in
brilliant, but
yeah,
always cast. Never.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I just bring this up as sides. Russell Jacoby's book, The Repression of Psychoanalysis. Thank you, Patrick. It's a good book about the Fenichel Circle and what happened in the 1950s, and also the book Rebel with a Cause, right?
Right.
Linder's great work here in the States, right? And who was treating, by the way, many nuclear physicists. He was a Bethesda, Maryland, I think, psychoanalyst, or he was in that mix, and many of his kind of pre-Daniel Ellsberg treatments. So anyway, this is all, I guess, kind of relevant going to Stiegler and the notion of adoption that he will bring up instead of adaptation. He does not use the word. His daughter has used, is it necessary to adapt? Right? And this is her attempt to kind of cast neoliberalism. It has not been translated. I read it about 3-4 months ago. It's worth reading. I don't think it's anything particularly original, but I do find it interesting as a summary and how the French, philosophers of today see the United States kind of on this historical plane, and the development of how we got here and how propaganda is formed and worked through. Another thing that came to mind too when I was reading this is Leo Lowenthal's work, Prophets of Deceit. Does anyone know that book? That's his book on propaganda too. So that was another very good one. Of the Frankfurt.
It's actually a good analysis to read with what happened in this country with Freud.
Yes.
Because I was reading it at that point in time. Yeah, it's good. So. Mm-hmm. It's published, I can think in 44, something like that.
44, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The same year as Dialectic of Enlightenment.
Yes. Yeah. And Lowenthal's completely forgotten, as we know, right?
Oh.
Just like Franz Neumann too, is completely forgotten. It's all Adorno and Marcuse and Benjamin now, and Horkheimer sort of, the MC himself was sort of forgotten too. Yeah, right. Anyway, yeah. All right. So since this thing, I mean, maybe I should ask you, what did you? I mean, this is very dense. Again, it presupposes, I think, a reading and a familiarity with Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. I figure most of us know it. I mean, you know, I don't know if we've read it recently or remember it, but you know, in a way, he's really looking at a long argument here. Against Marcuse. So first of all, desire as a natural state. This is his first working premise against all of this. You know, he really wants to take on Marcuse's notion of, you know, the historical plane and the structural plane of psychoanalysis. And he goes through this because he's trying to develop, you know, this kind of new libidinal economy that is much more dependent upon prosthetics or the fault of Epimetheus, going back to the myths. And if some of you remember Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, the myths that are prominent in that book, and Beryl mentioned this last week on Romanticism, was the Faustian urge, the Faustian project, you know, of course, a rereading of Goethe's, you know, always going beyond, right, where we are, this kind of moment. The Faust is a modern Prometheus in some ways, even though this is the pact with the devil, and et cetera. And he doesn't really mention that here, which, you know, he could have expanded. And then secondly, of course, Marcuse's use of Narcissus and Orpheus. And it was the Orphic moment that is very important for Marcuse, which was the liberation of, quote, drive, right, into eroticism and eroticization of everyday life. Stiegler wants to take takes a lot of issue with this. And in a way, this is a kind of return to Freud in a different way than Lacan to the letter of the text, but, you know, Freud being employed theoretically, you know, in terms of the meta works of Freud, you know, vis-a-vis Civilization. So there seem to be, you know, multiple texts at work here. Of course, Civilization and its discontents, the ego and the id, and totem and taboo seem to be the three primary texts that he's engaging of Freud, that Stiegler is. And of course, Marcuse, of course, Civilization and its discontents is kind of Marcuse's response to Freud's pessimism in Civilization and its discontent. So it seems to me that Stiegler is making a kind of full circle based on some of his argumentation to return to Freud in terms of the metapsychological. I don't know how you guys think. I mean, feel about this or think about it really, in a sense. Again, it's a very dense chapter. I mean, I can go through it. I'm sorry Josh isn't here because he's the one that, you know, suggested the May of '68 piece to lead up to this. So yeah, but he's in Jamaica, you know, taking care of his wife. So yeah. Anyway, so yeah, any thoughts? I mean, did you have time to read it, or you want me to just you know, work us through this, or what? Yeah. I mean, Richard, I'd certainly be interested to hear what you have to say about his attempt to return to Freud in a different way. I mean, I kind of see this as a move. There's a very good essay and a very good seminar here. Stiegler's Return to Freud, you know, in a different way than Lacan, right? In a way, yeah, kind of yeah.
Yes, I only got a chance to glance at it, so I'm
Okay,
gonna
okay,
follow along and
okay,
throw in my
okay. No problem. Yeah.
centimes from time.
Yeah, okay, no problem. If we come to some Greek terms, we'll go back. I mean, otium he uses operatively and throughout, and yeah. And I hope everybody, noetic really means the mental activity, but in this sense, noetic is really, you know, consciousness is intentionality. The nomadic noesis thing is the you know, in Husserlian terms, you always have intentional acts of consciousness. I want to emphasize this again. First of all, the appearance of the object on the level of appearance, then the comprehension of, you know, the acts of consciousness in terms of a part-whole relationship, and then consciousness maybe as a mediator. So there's always a threefold moment of these intentional acts of consciousness. You have to think of Husserl always talking about acts of consciousness, not just consciousness, right? Acts of, right? And intentional acts. So the way the object appears to us in its schematization, then of course it's the comprehending this in a part to whole schema through acts of reflection, and then of course is mediation. And of course what he's really trying to get to is the essential structure of the object, as well as the manner in which the object appears in the structure, the style or the manner, how it appears, and then what appears itself is in the manner of how it is appearing. So all of these things are going on in this essential structure, and the way we come to this is through meaning. This is where Husserl goes, that this is what actually establishes meaning and ultimately reference. So this is a very important thing, in terms of these acts of perception, the acts of perception. Yeah, Carl. Yeah.
So just in terms of just general impressions, I mean, I found this fascinating, what he's trying to do, and it seemed to me that in some ways he's taking a step closer to kind of what we were looking at in Deleuze and Guattari last time around. How do we understand the process of psychic formation, and the way in which the social structures penetrate
Right.
the our psyches. And I found that interesting. I will say that I felt like he sort of set out a path and a program and a set of questions that he didn't quite follow. It feels kind of
It is preliminary. I think you're right. I mean, this is a really a phenomenological sketch of what's to come. And we don't have time to read the third chapter, and then he makes a lot of promises here. We don't ever get the books, of which this is a fulfilling promise. Yeah. Unfortunately, he dies at 69 years old, but this was all part of a greater project. Richard, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I because Peter Bogdanovich died last week, I've been thinking about Peter Bogdanovich, watching some of his early films, his interviews with Orson Welles, and I rewatched The Magnificent Ambersons, the horribly deformed Magnificent Ambersons, what's left of it. And there's a moment when the Joseph Cotton character is insulted by the young guy who's courting his daughter from this wealthy family, who's a total jerk. And Cotton has made his money in his character has made his money in the automobile industry as it's starting out. And the kid goes, "Oh, I think automobiles are horrible." And Cotton's character reflects, and everyone thinks, "Oh gosh, he's the young guy is insulted this man whose daughter he's interested in." And Cotton goes, "You're right. You may be right." And I think it was, for me, I think with this Stiegler chapter in mind, was about, and also this French-Iranian Jewish writer, Ishak Burr, who wrote this 3-volume collection on Orson Welles, is that Welles is talking in a way himself, in cinema, that cinema is, he's this great innovator in cinema, and yet he has a kind of ambivalent feeling about what film will represent in terms of its, like the automobile, that it will have this, it'll affect, he says, the Joseph Cotton character says about consciousness, he says, "I think the automobile is going to change how we think, and not necessarily in a good way, but it's really going to change things." And I, with everything going on, I thought to myself, that's Orson Welles talking about cinema, that cinema is really changing everything, especially the filmmaker who makes Citizen Kane, which is such a reflection. He's the first filmmaker who goes to the Museum of Modern Art and asks to see old movies. You know, he really was the first filmmaker who thinks about what cinema is and what it's doing in a certain way. And so that whole question of you know, consciousness and cinema, and how it's, to me, it's you know, it's certainly something that was on the mind of Orson Welles as well.
Sure, sure. I think, I mean, going back to automobile, I think part of the thing here is what's sort of presupposed. You know, they don't frame it this way. I'm going to frame it this way. You know, certainly Stiegler, I'm sure Godard and others, you know, and as you said, Wells, you know, what has replaced Fordism, right, if you will, you know, as we talk about it on the left, is really the screen is a new mode of production. If you really want to think of it that way, as a new mode of production, that we're really not only in the screen New Deal, but there has been a shift, right, in terms of what is shaping and making consciousness today, right? And the shift is really to the screen, right? From the screen in 1895, you'll see in Kittler, he's looking at multiple things that came together, as well as I have another little book on principles in kinetic cinema, you know, early on, the movement, moving pictures, etc. So this multiplicity of movement that is taking place, of course, as you know, the movement from the silent to the talkies to, you know, different dimensions, you know, different types of screens, etc. And then, of course, the whole corresponding advertising industry, you know, etc. How it is used, etc. And I think that the interesting thing here, well beyond Stuart Ewan, who I respect deeply, captains of consciousness, Stiegler, Kittler, who will learn, you know, et cetera, and I think of course, Heidegger, who we read already, are really trying to go, and Benjamin are really trying to go to a very different level here, right? And in the sense to really read this as part of, you know, the structure of being itself in our time, right? In many ways, right? And that, you know, it's not so much just a Heideggerian language, you know, it's a phenomenology that's being used here by Stiegler. You'll see more Heidegger in Kittler. You know, he has a whole little section on the age of the worldview. He has, you know, a couple of pages. These are Berlin lectures, by the way, of Kittler that we're going to go through. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to bring this up. I mean, Wells is absolutely, and you know, Wells was never really given recognition beyond being just Orson Welles. But if you look at some of the smaller films that he used, I mean, they're filled with experimental, you know, vision, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Never
Fake
got
too.
recognition.
Very.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, Touch of Evil. I mean, one of our articles in Situations is on Touch of Evil. You know, as a border crossing, right? As the problem of the boundary and the border, and you know, it's an interesting take on it. You know, and yeah.
Who knows what, you know, the early descriptions of what was in the Ambersons, the other 2 hours that were destroyed,
right?
You know, which really took this family that succeeds in the industry, in the motor industry, in the automobile industry, and to such a dark place, you know, that Joseph Cotton was writing back from screenings in Brazil saying the audience can't take it. It's too dark. But, you know, I think it would now, if we looked at it, you know, we might think, oh, this guy was, you know, way ahead of his time. But.
Right. No, it's true. Yeah. David, you're here? You want to talk? Yeah. I see you did something in the chat.
Yeah, it was just you brought to mind the scene in Touch of Evil where Charlton Heston is in the car talking to I forget which other character about the southern border, and how like what made the southern border of America so special was that there weren't machine guns or a wall guarding it, and how terrible it would be if that's how it ended up because this crime was committed that was like a border crossing crime in the film and whatever.
Yes, absolutely. No,
Fascinating.
good point. You should send that to Donald Trump. Anyway, yeah, very good. Yeah, yeah, great. So, yeah, anyway, I mean, maybe we can cross between the cinematic consciousness and cinema and the Marcuse, but I would like to look at the Marcuse because I think what he's really doing here is he's giving us new terms for political economy. You know, he's really trying to use libidinal economy as political economy, that ultimately this is where we go. And I think this is one of his intentions, you know, here. And what he ultimately calls the aristocracy to come. You know, there's an aristocracy of the book, the workers of the book, but the aristocracy to come. What he means by that, I mean, we can always just project and suppose, but this is a term of I think was going to be the 5th book of Technics and Time. Yeah, yeah, incomplete. Yeah, at this point. So anyway, I mean, maybe what I can do is just maybe point out some of the.
Michael,
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Carl. Yeah. Yeah, Carl. Yeah.
oh, I just, as part of, also, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, my connection is bad. As part of also just framing the discussion, I would be interested in how people understand technics, his concept of technics, and I sometimes it felt like he was sort of rebaptizing things from Marx under this concept of technics, but I think he's also trying to do something quite different in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I would find that because that's kind of what
his influence is much more Andre Leroy, Gourhan, and of course Derrida and Difference. Right. Again, Stiegler, is very complicated because he's an amalgamation of so many high-powered theories that he's trying to put, into practice. Right. And in a way, we're trying to follow his logic here. Yeah, obviously he's influenced by Marx.
A lot of
yeah. Yeah.
It just seems like a lot of, his discussion of identification, individuation, disindividuation, sort of that is, I use this word in a way, mediation, or sort of, it sort of structures, maybe he would use the transductive relationship.
Well, these are terms of seminal. Unfortunately, we haven't read seminal here, but on the technical use of objects, who was a student of Gilles Deleuze, actually, or a colleague actually too, and so.
But the way I read Technics is it's kind of a cultural repository, and it's very much linked to, what in time 3 he talks about tertiary.
Yes, absolutely.
And
tertiary retention is very important. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when I was reading, I mean, this could just be my own limitation. I'm not making this as a statement about what I think he's doing, but to me it sounded in some ways very much in the tradition of things in Marx about, the general intellect, the role of science, these types of things, very much, this kind of repository of culture that is today increasingly sort of the feeding ground of capital, right? To appropriate knowledge, capitalize it, private. So that's kind of how
I understand the superimposition, if you will, on the face of Stiegler. I kind of
I mean that's just how I get it.
I get it. Yeah. You remind me of Deleuze in the beginning of Difference and Repetition. Put a beard on Hegel and you have Marx. Something like that. But I hear you. And we'll go back to that. I mean, I love the term general intellect from the Grundrisse, and I understand it very well. And I think a very crucial reading here would be analogous to this. Would be the work on machines, right? Fragments on machines in pages 690 to 720 and the Grundrisse, right? Very crucial.
And also the appendix to volume 1, it's the immediate results of the
processes of production. Yeah.
Talks also there about these ideas.
Okay, let me go to Richard before I maybe go to.
I was just going to say apropos of technics. I mean, for me also, it always recalls Plato, and in particular the statesman of Plato, which really foregrounds in the word politikos, politics. It's that suffix in Greek that we have, for example, in politics, and which Plato elaborates on in The Statesman, so that in technology, I always hear this bridge back to politics, as if the forgetting of the politics or the political dimension that Stiegler is going to discover is what he really is in part doing, in the tradition of Derrida and Heidegger and such, is this going back to, like with the idea of the pharmacon, that technics, it's not by chance that it has this prehistory in Plato, and that what he's in a way that it foreshadows the political future, you could say, or the political importance of this idea of prosthetic, of technology, as if it were always there, but it had been forgotten.
Right. See, Carl, I think if you read the general intellect in Marx as a supplement, like Stiegler probably would, you would see some comparisons here. Because for Stiegler, what we're doing here is all supplementary, right? It's a Derridian notion. We're part of the supplement, right? In this pharmacon and this movement between,
Well, another point, is it's in some ways in a very different vein. I thought of this much more in terms of technics and time than this reading, is the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who talked a lot about memory and consciousness and the role of, the materialization of culture in things. I mean, he was very concerned. Now, this was prior to the screen and the cell phone. He was talking about like books, things, objects. Very different, but it's the same idea. That very much the kind of materialization of Hegel in some way.
right. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can get into this argument with Marcus. I'm sorry about the phone ringing. I'm just not going to pick it up. Anyway, if the cell rings, I may have to pick it up. But anyway, I apologize for that. Oh yeah. Just give me 1 second. We'll go to the text in 1 second. Yeah. I have a friend with the COVID. I'm going to just sign off for a second and I'll be right back. Okay. I'm sorry about that. It'll just be a minute. Yeah. Matt, are you still here? Matt? We can move from there or thinking about the chapter. Yeah.
No, we all sat in silence, more or less.
Oh, okay. Well, wow. Okay.
The teacher's absent and we became silent.
Yep.
We were
All
meditating.
went to ground.
Meditating.
Turned off everything.
Yeah, just sitting around
Okay.
meditating.
Throwing
Okay, I'm
spitballs
sorry
at
about
each
the
other on
delay.
the screen.
This was a necessary thing. If I get another call, I won't take it unless.
Oh no, that's
I'm sorry. Yeah. So anyway, let me do this then. the way I would problematize this, or first of all, give the summary, is the first thing that Stiegler really takes on is this lacuna in psychoanalysis, that it lacks an ultimately satisfactory or adequate, to use Spinoza's language, theory of sublimation. And he takes his point of departure here from J.B. Pontalis, good friend of Sartre, and Jean Laplanche, who wrote the original vocabulary of psychoanalysis. And of course, Laplanche later did new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, two major French analysts. Laplanche was very close to Lacan in the beginning, and also as a participant and actor or interviewee in Agnes Varda's film, the Gleaners, les Glissons, right? Yeah, he at his summer house, the Vineyard too. He's known to have a very good vineyard of fine wines. So it goes to show you nothing's too good for the aristocracy of Lacanian analysis. Anyway, so. Anyway, I think this is, this is a very interesting a moment that he wants to go through. He says, Stiegler really begins with two quotes. One about this was the impetus for this chapter was finding new weapons for a polemology of spirit, for new polemics about what is spirit, the value of spirit. And, he makes a point later of saying both the ego and the id, 1923 being a crucial year, the ego and the id, and the crisis of spirit in European institutions and the value of spirit by Paul Valéry, which he likes very much and he uses often, in terms of his notion of what the Geist is, or esprit in French, right, in this sense, right? So these are two moments, that impetus and also this lack of what he considers an adequate theory of sublimation. So with Marcuse, who is basically the foil throughout this, and please intervene whenever you feel like. The other epigraph is from Baudelaire, in terms of the decadence of our societies. This is another moment. And, as you know, Benjamin was very, very fond of Charles Baudelaire. The other one here is true civilization does not consist in gas or steam or turntables. It consists in the diminution of all the traces of original sin. And this is, again, what Stiegler will go against, guilt and guilt formation in the superego. This will be a primary, attack on, certain notions of the superego, how it was formed in civilization. So for Marcuse, the fundamental problem was his reading of Freud, right? Was the central position that the reality principle has become the performance principle. And those of you that know Marcuse, performance principle is where surplus repression is located, right? And he talks about the performance principle in the service of what he calls surplus repression. And Stiegler then begins a kind of critique of what he considers to be Marcuse's ahistorical approach to libido, right? And that he has this notion of libido as somewhat embedded in nature and as a naturalistic thing. So he calls for a change, if you will, in perspective, right? On a very different type of perspective, right? That is, he divides the libidinal history, if you will, into two: the structural as permanent and the historical as always changing. This is what he sees in Marcuse, right? That the structural is permanent, not for Stiegler, right? So he wants to take this on, that the historical is a non-permanent, and it becomes the performative principle in the industrial era, that we have to create surplus repression. This is the Marcuse, the Marxist speaking, obviously, in some senses. For Stiegler, this is misguided, right? So he's basically, what Stiegler wants to do is say, Marcuse forgets that the process of the formation of psychoanalytic categories, the psychic, the collective, the technical, what is important, are the relationships that are happening between them, not this dualism of tendencies or oppositions. And I don't know if you remember this part of the reading, but what Stiegler is going to take on is this oppositional tendency throughout Marcuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Historical, structural, eros thanatos, right? Right? Yeah. Performance principle, pleasure principle, reality principle. So he wants to take that on very, very much, and he also wants to say that Marcuse really believes, and this is the idealism of Marcuse, that the pleasure principle precedes the reality principle rather than being in a relation always. So you can see the Lacanianism coming through here. And also, the return to Freud in a very different way, because, Marcuse is obviously trying to rewrite Freud, for a new perspective on, this privileging of eros and, again, the eroticization of everyday life. Remember, he writes this in 55, Eros and Civilization. For that time, it's quite radical, at least to the, to the psychoanalytic meta world, if you will. Okay, so what they have in common is, and Stiegler will point this out, and maybe I can go to some pages here, is that Stiegler says what they have in common is jump-starting in terms of a revolutionary approach to psychoanalysis, right, and what it can be doing. He says on the bottom of page 45 in particular, he says, writing and reading these works, right? Yeah. Anyway, the reading of Freud postulated by Marcuse presumes, on the contrary, in its stiff, ambiguous, and hesitant way, that the pleasure principle precedes its domination by the reality principle. It presumes, that is, the pleasure principle precedes the reality principle itself as a kind of lost paradise, and it's interesting, it goes back to this atomic myth, it precedes the reality principle as a kind of lost paradise from which the desiring subject will have fallen after some kind of fault. Perhaps this fault would consist in technicizing life, that is, killing it through the internalization of that deadness that is technics. The desiring subject would then have fallen into a fate consisting in the repression of the drives or instincts, and he uses, he understands trieb as drive, not as instinct, and the domination of the reality principle over the pressure principle, as if the history of desire, this is the critique, must take the form of a negative eschatology, that of an apocalypse. And this is very important. This time, the time would have come, however, for us to rise up and escape from this apocalypse via the messianic leap of revolutionary struggle. And this is a pretty good summation, I think, of where Marcuse is in terms of his work. Writing and reading these words, Stiegler replies, I cannot help but be struck by the resemblance in its general outline between this process and what myself have described as the path leading from the prehistoric human group to the control societies. And control societies is obviously a play on both Burroughs and Deleuze's famous essay, Societies of Control. And again, I think it's important we keep in mind while reading Stiegler and most of the French theory today, that the passage has gone much from Foucault's notion of the disciplinary societies, from the Polizeiwissenschaften to almost a full society of control where no longer even the ideological repressive state apparatuses are necessary. It's just the RSA that's accepted, right, in a way. Richard, you want to say something? Yeah. No? Okay. That's all you.
Hey, sorry,
Yeah.
what page
Yeah.
are you? What
I'm on
page are
page
you on?
45. It's a good summation of where he is here after he goes back, because he wants to go into processionality, et cetera, right? And how he's a little different than Marcuse, put it mildly. These societies have now become uncontrollable, right? The societies of control, Deleuze's societies of control, and therefore require what is, in the decadence of industrial democracy I call a jump start, right? Like, hooking up the car, igniting, right? Again, right? The jump start, which I believe to be revolutionary. Nevertheless, the profound difference, and this is crucial, between my discourse and Marcuse's thinking lies in his presupposition of a kind of natural state of desire, that somehow desire can be naturalized, whereas I posit the desire is constituted through its artifactuality. This is very important. Again, going back to what Carl mentioned earlier, the general intellect, if you want to consider artifactuality, you can, certainly superimpose general intellect onto Stiegler. However, the artifactuality that he's talking about has to do, again, with technics and technics as time. Right? Furthermore, the path that has led the societies to become uncontrollable does not seem to me to be a continuous straight line. And this is very important too, in the destruction of individuation, that is desire. Rather, it consists in a series of oscillations, admittingly of increasing amplitude, alternating between disindividuating tendencies and a reconstruction. On the basis of these same tendencies, new types of individuation process, that is, in new forms of collective and psychic and collective individuation. Herein lies the play of what I call the doubly epochal, and we talked a little bit about this, the double epoch in Technics and Time, in the chapter on cinematic, and that he always wants to go through this epochal doubling, right? This redoubling that happens, right? Of the historical epochs of individuation. The technological epoche is always disindividuating, and therefore requires an individuating redoubling formed through the practices of individuation, and in this case through hyponesic practices of otium, which I refer to as care. Okay, so again, I'm going to go just a little bit further here. Stiegler's main thing, as you get to the end of this chapter and later in the book, is about a community of care, the therapeutic care. He goes through the notions of the therapeutic from the Greek, how many different connotations it has, and to build this, kind of society of care. And, taking his point of departure somewhat from Heidegger, but I think much deeper in a way, much more community ordered, if you want to say, with the Mitsein of the other always presupposed in this, right? Or the transit individuation process. So anyway, let me just go back, and again, this is again crucial, is therefore a matter, therefore, of thinking care, not just care, thinking care that must be sought within each historical or genealogical stage of a series of individuations as that which enables a psychopathology to be articulated with a sociopathology. That is, that enables individuation to be thought in terms of political economy, apolitical economy, itself conceived on the basis of libidinal economy. So again, outside of Marx and commodity and alienation, right? He is going to try to think this in terms of a libidinal economy, and this was always, a thing in France. What happened to the libido in Marx, right? What happened with this? Why was this not really, presupposed to begin with? And of course, one great reading of Marx, by the way, that brings the body back in is Michel Onry's book, The Philosophy of Marx. That Marx's great discovery really was not just, surplus value or if you will, of course, alienated labor and, rates of exploitation, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, all of these things that we take sort of for granted in reading Marx today. But it was really the body, how the body is in the factory, what's going on. That Marx, as a phenomenologist, was really thinking through body and body processes. In Stiegler's case, desire. This is going to be a question of desire and political economy, and a new kind of economy of desire. So the next step, and I please stop me because look, again, he's setting up this tension between natural desire and artifactuality. right, against Marcuse, right, in many ways, right? Yeah, yeah. What were we going to say, Carl? I'm sorry.
Oh, it's sort of, yeah, I was struck by the way he uses libido, desire, and drive. Those are like these three categories. I'm trying to find, it's back in the prior chapter where he talks about how the libido sort of binds the binding force of the drives. So he seems to, this is on page 7. Um, and it seems, and then the way I understand his understanding of desire is fantasy. Desire is sort of like how we project ourselves in fantasy as something other than what we are now, and that distance is how he understands the basis of desire. I just, they're just sort of like how he's using these terms.
Well, he uses libido differently than drive.
I
I
think
mean,
it's
he's really
interesting.
trying to get back to
And I wonder how that,
libido. He said the limit, going back to page 7, which you talk about, what is being here to refer to as symbolic misery is the way that the exploitation of libidinal energy tends to exhaust it, right? With the result that when this process approaches its conclusion, right, libidinal energy is replaced by the unleashing of drive-based tendencies. So you have a tendency of the drive here instead of, the tendential, fall of the rate of profit. You can look at the tendential fall of the rate of libido exhaustion, right? In a way. Maybe a way of looking at it in terms of scale, like Adorno and Horkheimer did the F scale, right? The fascist scale that I think one of your professors was very active in presenting at the Left Forum years ago, Richard. Right?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, just if you go on two sentences further, he talks about the binding force that was libidinal energy as the premier energy of capitalism then becomes an unbound force, decomposing the drives that were no longer bound.
Yeah, no longer
by
bound.
libidinal energy, and
So they're not
right.
they're
I just thought that it's
relative.
kind of when I was reading.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I didn't have the time to do it. Oh, I didn't have the time to do it, but I wanted to go look again at the id and the ego, and see how his use of these compares to Freud, because I know that there was like a big debate about Freud's theory of the drives and how it changed. And anyway, I just thought this was interesting, just in terms of
brought here against Marcuse, and in some ways, what he's really saying is in this. If you want to look at the tendency of the libido in the epoch, if you want to call it, like I said today, we're in the mode of production by the screen, right? We're in a new mode of production determined by the screen, no longer the automobile. Post-Fordism is really the screen dominated, if you will, underlined, of course, by this shift into the Gestell and the framing and the reserve stock that Heidegger speaks about. How do we begin to understand this tendency of the libido to exhaust itself? And then what it does, and very much true of the anti-vaxxers out here, you can begin to see this working out in our society, in a sense, how this new binding force, right, becomes drive-driven, not really libidinal driven, right, in a way. He's really trying to make this thing, that this decomposition itself, right, is so displaced, right, is so diverted at this point that it no longer, it's just a drive tendency, an unbound force, decomposing the drives that were bounded by the libidinal energy, the latter no longer being able to contain them because it has been destroyed. The libidinal energy in this moment.
So do you think like
at this point, but listen to me, son. At this point, capitalism has manifestly, and I said this book should be called Capitalism Has Lost Its Mind. He says, has manifestly lost its mind. The spirit that was its ability that is able to unify multiplicity and multiply the one in the age of the machine, that is in the age of technical reproducibility. This ability played out not only on the plane of machines, but through the translation. And this is important for Stiegler, the translation of this plane, right? This plane of technical reproducibility, he's using Benjamin's language, of this plane onto the psychic and collective planes, and through the projection of a plane of their common consistency, or consistency uses, that is by projecting the temporality of a political and social project that was for a long time was called progress. And if we can give up this notion of progress, as Adorno does, as Nietzsche does, as Milan Kundera does in in his own work, if we can give this up, we begin to understand very differently. We get out of this Marxist notion that somehow it's going to be better, right, with social democracy or whatever. I think this is much deeper than anything we're really talking about. For a long time in a small street, he goes on, the giant far progress. We read this last week, but do you see what's happening here? He's really trying to show that, the libidinal energy is no longer bounded. This is an unbounded set of drives that are put into place, right?
The way I think I'm helpful is that I think I'm understanding what he's doing here is that it seems like the superego is related to sublimation, and that sublimation process is related to the way in which the libido binds the drives into some sort of more coherent project of individuation.
Well, he wants new forms of sublimation.
Right, but I think he's talking about how that
Marcusian notion of, yes, he wants to get through this repressive desublimation. He doesn't think these are adequate terms. Yeah. Remember, this is a polemic at one level with Boltanski and Chiapello in the first chapter, The New Spirit of Capitalism. It's a long polemic with this. Mm-hmm. This kind of distinction that's drawn between artistic and social critique, right? He wants to bring that back around into one, right? In a sense, he wants to take apart that dualism and make it into, there should be no separation between the artistic and social. Again, we have to think relationally. We can't think in terms of positivism, and we can't think only in terms of concept formation, right? He wants us to think always relationally. And this is this concept, this is this process he's getting from Simondon, transduction. It's not deductive or inductive anymore. It's a transducing, transduction relationship that's going on. And the triad is always psychic, collective, and then finally technical individuation. This is always working in a relational sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the working triad always for him. So progress, movement. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I have a question in terms of, he talks about libidinal energy.
Yeah. And
then he talks about drive-based tendencies.
Right.
And he's seeing them as different.
Right.
Yeah.
Because my understanding of Freud is libido is essentially a drive. I may be wrong here. And what happens is that the libidinal drives that basically get bound up in certain ways, cathected in terms of satisfying themselves.
Yeah.
And the fundamental drive is the one for the desire for the mother, the Oedipal complex. And the way in which that gets bound up is, first off, it's frustrated, but it gets bound up in the development of the superego, which constrains the realization of that the drive wants to accomplish, but it gets expressed as a sense of guilt within the individual, where that libidinal drive basically is directed back at one's own self. I see these as really the same, and I'm questioning the translation here, not Stiegler. I can question him about Marcuse. That's a different issue, but
just to say, I think what I think he's doing though is that I think he's talking about libido here in a way that's related to identification, right? That the superego forms out of identification with the others. That's my memory of Freud, and that then involves a process of sublimation, a redirection, right, of drives. But I agree with you that's how I sort of read Freud, is that libido and drives are kind of the same thing. They're not like these two different things. And he seems to be,
He's not saying they're different.
maybe
He's
it's
saying
translation.
liminal
Yeah.
energy composes, right, into this unboundedness, this unbound energy, if you will, that no longer is related to libido. It's just part of drives, right? And in a sense, it's no longer connected to, for Stiegler, libido is, as the title of the chapter says, the passage of desire as original diversion of libidinal energy, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's really looking, yes, he's in agreement with Freud that, and Marcuse in a sense, that libido is the energy, right?
And
This
and he talks about another place here about the decline of the family, the decline of the father. I mean, basically, which Marcuse talks about too, in terms of repressive desublimation.
yes.
And so that, I mean, and that's where this is my interpretation. That's when the drive-based tendency, because they're no longer bound up in the development of the superego, which the family essentially organizes human psychology into, and that they're freed up and they're directed in a different direction. And that's what he's talking about here.
Mhm.
Am I
Yes.
making sense or
Oh,
not? I
yeah. I
mean,
mean, I hear
You are
what
to
you're
me.
saying. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Yeah.
think it's good to stay with the text too. But
oh
yes,
yeah, no.
I hear what you're saying, and your understanding is right on in a way. I mean, for the woman, it's the father instead of the mother. But anyway, Jung came up with the Electra complex. Our Gentile friend there, in the movement, came up with the Electra complex.
Yeah, I know. I'm all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
understand. Yeah, but let me just go here. Let me just go a little further here to section 2, because this is to me very interesting what he's trying to do. See, he says that look, again, the question is that of desire here,
And what
right?
page is this?
This is on page 47,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Okay, and it's in the section called section 2. From Psychopathology 46, Marcuse's distinction between the structural plane and the historical plane is from the perspective of a theory, and this is his theory, a psychosocial technical individuation invalid. But nevertheless, he does utilize this distinction to pose psychopathological problems in sociopathological terms, that is, in political terms. And this is very interesting how what Richard was saying earlier, the political comes back in here, right? We don't speak this way, the political as social pathological, although we did a lot around Trump. We psychologized to death, right? In that sense. Okay, it is true, and this is so despite the fact that no structural plane can be isolated as an element from the relation that is the reality principle, that the reality principle unfolds historically, or more precisely, that there is a historical becoming, and this is important too, of the relation between pleasure and desire. Notice he doesn't say pleasure and reality. He says pleasure and desire. He doesn't say pleasure and pain. He says pleasure and desire. This being the case, this relation, if not this element, may be indeed, right, become an object, not just of psychic care, but of collective, right, struggle. Okay, so this is the beginning of the politics, from psychopathology to sociopathology. This is why it appears that the distinction between the structural and the historical is what enables the articulation of the psychic and the collective, that is, psychoanalysis and politics. Psychological categories have become political categories. This is Marcuse. The cure of personal disorder depends more directly than before on the cure of the general disorder. The goal is laudable by Marcuse. The present work has a similar objective, and I argue that blaming parents and children and medicalizing their psychic suffering serves only to conceal, and this is very, very radical and good, I think, in a way, only conceals the historical processes destroying libidinal energy. Okay? Marcuse, however, fails in his undertaking because instead of studying relations, and again important, he prefers to define elements. Okay? He becomes like a good, scientific Marxist. He defines elements instead of only studying the relations, if you will. He prefers to define that the imagines can be referred back to an ontology, right? And he believes this because he does not perceive the place of the artifact. And then now we're going to go back to technics, right? And technics in time and the constitution of desire. This failure, which will contribute to the persistence of the ambiguities of artistic critique, back to the first chapter with Chiapello and Boltanski, must today be meticulously analyzed, given that a new critique must be formulated to confront capitalism's loss of spirit. This is Stiegler now, his project. Psychoanalytic categories have a genesis, and to this extent, psychopathology is a social pathology. In this genesis, it is the artifact and therefore the accident, that is, exteriorization, that sets things into motion. Marcuse tries to reconstitute the genesis of the reality principle so as to ground his critique of Freud. But this critique relies on an erroneous and above all regressive reading. Marcuse would have us turn back to a discourse of the opposition of tendencies, right? The oppositions of tendencies, where they're only processes of the composition of tendencies. And I think this is very important for the thinking with Stiegler. And think of, instead of thinking oppositionally, eros and thanatos only, or life against death, as Norman O. Brown wrote, a very brilliant meditation in the 50s as well, alongside Eros and Civilization. But to think of this composition of tendencies, it was one of Freud's, and I like this very much to me, this is very insightful, major achievements to have established a form of thinking that after Plato was completely new. And that was first rediscovered by Nietzsche. And what is this thinking? We can go back to Heidegger too. This way of thinking was characteristic of Heraclitus, but more generally constituted the pre-Socratic tragic sense of thought. Marcuse's critique is things. So there's a return to this tragic age. You know, those of you that would be interested in following this up, philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, Homer's Contest, all of these are pieces of Nietzsche early on. And of course, what's behind all of this in a way, which I don't think Marcuse read carefully enough and the French read more carefully, was the Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche. This is very important, you know, or I would subtitle it, How Marxists Should Avoid Morality, right, in their assessments. Everybody's corrupt, working proposition of post, you know, of neoliberalism, et cetera, right? Okay, so Marcuse's critique is regressive to the extent that the constitutive elements of the tendencies, once they have been decomposed by his critique, no longer seem to be tendencies at all. That is, forces composing in a process in which they constitute and co-individuate themselves. Rather, they seem to be hypostasized powers, and as such, principles. Freud's great accomplishment, and this is interesting, he's using Freud against Marcuse, right? And it's a nice turn here. And I think this is very important to think this through. Freud's great accomplishment, however, was to have shown that only the play of forces is open to analysis. Forces must be distinguished, but they can no longer be opposed, since it is the relation through which they compose that constitutes them. Excuse me. Forces, which are also processes, may indeed appear to be principles, but this merely reflects the fact that they may be metastabilized in historical forms, and this is very important, again, that seem stable, but which are in fact metastable. It is inherent to every epoch to naturalize processes that are in reality as social and historical organizations of the play of forces, artifactual, and as such, simulacra. Okay? Very, very important here, right? In his wish to inscribe the becoming of forces in a historical process in which he'll be able to oppose them. And again, he's really exposing and deconstructing, if you will, in a very powerful way, I think Marcuse's, you know, attempt to really, in a sense, almost almost idealize Freud, right, into the point of, this new, transfigured, world of, eroticized relations. Marcuse fails to see the question is the and through the forces, right, instead of the either or the oppositional, which the psychic and the collective compose. Nor does he see that this and, in which constitutes the simultaneously conjunctive and disjunctive relation of the psychic to the collective, is technics. So this is the third term that's coming in. You could add general intellect here. I'm fine with that, but I'm not so sure Stiegler would agree. But technics for him, again, this is the fault at the origin, the Epimethean fault, right? In a sense, shaping us, right? In a sense, it's no longer, we have this tendency to always think, we don't think individuation, we think individual. We don't think subjection, we think subject, right? Or subjectivity. And this is a very, it's a different way that we're very much accustomed to thinking. Marcuse is unable to perceive that technics conjoins and disjoins two planes that form in their tension a process. And again, emphasis on process of individual. That is a genealogy that translates or transforms the play through which the pleasure and the reality principle compose. Because, Marcuse, those of you that have read it, is really privileging the pleasure principle ultimately over the reality principle. He is really reworking this completely to fit a kind of world where he thinks that the affluent society can transform the world into this pleasure-based, pleasure principle-based, and that the reality principle itself is dominant, right? Only as a dominant reality principle, but is not really connected to reality. Stiegler is going against this, right? Against this kind of framing. Despite having done, and as always, right? Marcuse did introduce, however, the legitimate goal of thinking psychoanalytic categories as a becoming. And this is important too, going back to the pre-Socratic thought and the tragic, right? Yeah, in a way. And as an always, already, psychosocial becoming rather than as a pre-established fixed psychic structure. This is interesting. And so, he gives credit where credit's due. He's very admiring of Marcuse. Remember, he thinks that Marcuse is very much responsible for May of '68 in some ways. You can go through, and I have my own thoughts about this, but yeah, certainly, you remember the 3M company, Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. That was the 3M, right? Yeah. So anyway, despite having done so, however, the distinction between the structural and the historical plane, and he does this throughout, and again, it would be great to, reread Eros and Civilization in this light, right? I mean, this is another thing that I think this is a very, very careful reading of the text. End up contributing to the generation of ambiguities that befell artistic critique. He's going back to the social pathology of May of '68, ambiguities that continue to close off opportunities for real critique. And I'm adding the real critique. We have the critique that's ongoing, but it's almost kind of banal, real critique. On this point, the elaboration of a new critique passes through the critique of Marcuse, and in so doing, through a general critique of psychoanalysis, of which is here possible only to sketch the outlines, right? So he's going to, further this later. Okay, so I don't know if this helps. I mean, I think this second part is very good at setting out the goals, if you will, setting the sails for where he wants to go. Both thinking with and against Marcuse and trying to propose something different. Yeah.
I just, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot here. I had a lot of thoughts and questions about this. I mean, I guess in one way, reading this, it didn't seem, in one way, like he's proposing anything that new as kind of like a program of research or inquiry, in the sense that, he's talking about you can't just sort of presuppose this kind of pre-given human nature that's prior to, the repressive apparatus of civilization. And in fact, so I guess just, maybe because I was in part trained by Richard Lichtman, who wrote a book where he was trying to actually move between Marx's concept of reification and alienation and Freud's concept of neurosis. I don't
Right.
know that he was successful, but it was, that attempt to say that
Right.
Freud is not talking about universal tendencies, he's talking about a kind of psychic formation. Um,
You
but I guess I also, and this is just a question, like, l- oh, I mean, to me, when I was reading this, it's like if you do away with anything that's kind of prior to the social, right, or the historical, it does seem you lose something like, I mean, Marcuse is trying to sort of make an ethical critique in the sense that capitalism injures something in human beings that need to be corrected in some way. And I think what Stiegler is actually arguing is that what's being damaged is the process of the formation of a coherent superego and the passage from identification to individuation. That's kind of how I see the real difference between them.
I mean, yeah, I mean that's fair enough. I mean, but again, he's really again trying to say, we're in a very different space now, right? And
Yeah,
that the
yeah.
tools that we need are very different, right, in a
Mhm.
sense. And this is again the beginning of a polemology, as he says in the beginning, of attacking, if you will, on a frontal basis, but with great respect, the Marcusean position of repressive desublimation, the Marcusean position of only surplus repression, this vocabulary. He goes through this very carefully here. I think, this
Oh
is
yeah, yeah.
trying to do, right? Again, right? And the third term, he's really talking about blockages of psychic individuation, but also the blockage of collective individuation, that we are basically stuck, right? We are in an aporia, and Marcuse contributes to that aporia, if you will, that we are at a limit that we cannot find a passage. He's really looking for that place, that opening of the passage. It's like Jung and Heidegger on the line in 47. Here's Stiegler in 2000. I think this was in France, published in 2004. We didn't get it, or 2006, and we didn't get it to 2014. But anyway, he's here again trying to deal with an aporia that we cannot get any passage through. And he's going through the critique of his works that we have this almost strict, almost catechism to, right? And we're trying to, he's trying to think beyond this, right, in many ways. So again, he does so with great respect. This is not a trashing for trashing's sake, or just to throw out the baby in the bathwater. It's also an attempt to look at how false a Marxist Freudian synthesis sometimes can be, too, right? He's also trying to show this as well, right, in many ways. Yeah, yeah. And he's also trying to adhere again to the reality principle in relation to the pleasure principle, not as something that needs to be overcome, right? He understands this in a different way. And I think this is why he's closer to the civilization and discontents position, right, in many ways, with I think more of a sharper eye, through technics and the technical individuation that's going on than Marcuse. He's really trying to go back to that Freud, yeah, in a way.
Yeah,
The attack
exactly.
also on the superego, both in its religious and in its indebted form, right? He's really trying to get away from this notion of the original sin or the guilt, right, of the superego. How is that made, right? How is that done, right, in culture? So again, he's rereading, and Lacan did this, I think, in the 50s in his seminars, early seminars on technique in Freud, refers very actively, if I remember correctly, in the second, the 53 or 54 seminar, 1953, 54, after he's kicked out of the IPA, and he speaks about the ego and the id. There's no need for a superego, right? He's in agreement with Melanie Klein on this. There's no, in a sense, he understood this as a cultural tag on, right? In a way. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if this is making sense, but I'm trying to say, look, he's in a polemic here with a work that's 60 something years old, right? But he's using works that are 100 years old in order to, it's not a question of just progressive calandrial time that we're looking at here. We're looking at thought, right? And how it plays out and where he's going, right? So anyway.
Well, one place where it seems like that's also interesting is page 70, although maybe we want to get there later. But I think this is where he brings himself closest in some ways to Marcuse, because the phrase "the automatization of the superego" actually comes directly out of Marcuse. Marcuse actually.
Well, I mean, that's a good place to go to. Maybe we should begin with, we can go to the automatization of the superego and then go back. But yeah, page 69, he cites, first of all, this section on Eros and Thanatos, right, from Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, and he critiques, right? And this is page 69. But must we really say that Thanatos is the hostile partner of Eros? This is very important, to think this way. It's not really just life against death, right? It's life and death, which is a very good title of a book by Laplanche. Richard, you know that book? It's a really solid reading of this whole thing. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Or is it not rather the Thanatos? And this is interesting too. The very good thing about Stiegler's questioning mind that I like personally is the tendency through which Eros passes. Right? This is very Heideggerian too, in a different way, but certainly Freudian in some ways, through which Eros posits itself by composing with it. Okay? Yeah. And if this positing of Eros posits it as the object through which it projects itself, is Thanatos not what in this object as fetish, that is, as death, mirror, artifact, enables projection as this deadness that seizes life, but where equally life seizes itself as an object of its own fantasy. Very, very good. Yeah, I think, right? Yeah. And would this not be then a better way to interpret the apparent tendency to decomposition that would be the mechanism or the escapement of the destruction of civilization? Then he goes back to Marcuse. Culture demands continuous sublimation. It therefore weakens Eros, according to Marcuse, the builder of culture. And desexualization, by weakening Eros, unbinds the destructive impulses. Civilization is thus threatened by an instinctual or a drive diffusion. The whole question lies in the interpretation of the historical process of this unbinding, and perhaps in the misunderstandings of this subject that the ego and the id describes as a kind of dialectic of the desires. That's nice. I like that phrase, the dialectic of the desires. Read ego and id as this moment. This dialectic leads through the play of diversions, right, to a decomposition of tendency that must perpetually compose in order for desire to exist, right? And it is for this reason that Thanatos should not be referred to simply as the hostile partner of Eros. Marcuse sees very well how new forms of control are established through the functionalization of leisure. He's very good at this. He comes up in a period with Vance Packard, he knows his Veblen, he knows all of this, he knows Galbraith, he knows all the liberal, writings, as well as, what really happened here, right? And it is this he refers to as the automation, right, of the superego. Right? The automation of the super. This automation of the superego indicates the defense mechanism by which society meets the threat. The defense consists chiefly in strengthening of controls over consciousness. The manipulation of consciousness, which has occurred throughout the orbit of contemporary industrial civilization, consists in the coordination of the private and the public existence of spontaneous and required reactions. This extension of controls to formerly free regions of consciousness and leisure permits a relaxation of sexual taboos. Okay? Sex in suburbia. Yeah, you have all kinds of things here. You can go back and, think about this. Okay, so Marcuse here describes how a capitalism has lost spirit, has an interest in liquidating the super egoistic barriers to consumption and substituting for it an automatic superego. Very interesting, right? How this is going on. But he ascribes this process merely to the submission of the pleasure principle to the reality present, that is to calculation or to calculated rationality, right? Here called utility. The fundamental antagonism between sex and social utility is blurred by the progressive encroachment of the reality principle on the pleasure principle. This is Marcuse. The problem, however, is not that the reality principle takes control, and I think this is important, especially for us, right? Takes control of the pleasure principle, since these are perpetually composing, forming what Derrida called their stricture, right? Rather, the problem is the decomposition of tendencies that leads to hypersynchronization, that is, to becoming herd-like, right? Which is also the rule of the death drive, to which is opposed a hyper-diachronization, right? The latter, however, in fact, amounts to the same thing, since the drives, unbound, here, the unbound drives, not libido, right? The unbound drives, right? Not libidinal energy per se, become inherently destructive of all sociality. Think about where we are today. Yeah, I mean, in this passage, sociality conceived as psychic and collective individuation is possible only if the psychic I is not conflated with the we, whereas unbinding leads to rule by the they, that is, to the marriage of stupidity and ressentiment. And you want to talk about the right wing, you can see this playing out in terms of the psychic structure of what's happening politically, globally, everywhere. It's not only in the United States, right? And right. What's going on? We cannot go along then with Marcuse's reasoning conducted at the level of principles, right? Again, the opposite, what Stiegler's trying to do is to read relationally, to read in terms of, a different kind of way of looking at this instead of just bringing in principles to the reason, where the true question is the economy of the drives, right? And this is really the important part, the economy of the drives. On the contrary, in terms of the impact on the social relation that must be renewed between pleasure and reality, we must re-elaborate this question, and this is good, I like this, on the relation between otium and negotium, which will be the subject of the aristocracy to come, the fourth volume of Disbelief and Discredit. Yeah, he didn't get to it, unfortunately, but there are hints towards what's happening. So the otium, the thinking care, and negotium in terms of relations is really working here. It was against this automation of the superego that the youth of 68 rose up. Right? He's going back to 68, to May of 68. This automation is something like the translation in the modern industrial age of the discrediting of human law and the impiety to which was a symptom which was embodied by the figure of Creon in the Antigone, and against which the titular character revolted in a salutary complexification of the Oedipus complex, avuncular dimension being notable here. Right? Very interesting. In our case, though, the problem does not lie with the calculations of Creon in an Athens where the divine draws away. Rather, it lies in the implementation and general application as the deployment of control society and machine-based calculability, hence of an automated calculability. This automated calculability is devised with a goal, and this is important, of diverting libidinal energy towards those channels that most rapidly accelerate the process of return on investment, not libidinal investment, but financial. Very smart here. Very, very smart. Yeah. I don't know if you know who CZ is, but he's the head of Finance, a Chinese mathematical wizard in his 40s. He's now one of the 5 richest people in the world. He's 43. $98 billion is his net worth, right? He has Finance. This is the new Bitcoin. He's the new kid on the block. CZ he's known as, right? In a sense. How do we think about this in terms of what Stiegler is talking about here? This kind of like machine-based calculability, right? The return on investment that is no longer cathected. This is financial cathectization, right? Financial investment. I think the translation of Freud's, the German would be better translated as investment, but the English people like cathected for some reason. The French use investment. Investment, right? And when they use cathected. Okay, so on this point, Marcuse is not clear, even though he understands, obviously, calculated rationality, but he shouldn't be blamed for this. On the contrary, his analysis shows remarkable foresight, despite being based on an erroneous interpretation of Freudian thought. He does not clearly identify the issue that was the sale of available brain time. And this is very good. I like this. The sale of brain capital and brain time as this new service that is out there in many ways, right? Leads to the proletariatization of consumers, the liquidation of their knowing how to live, savoir vivre, that is of both their Cyclickeit, he puts this in Kantian and really in Hegelian language more, but the Cyclickeit, which is probably ethical society, the realm of the ethics, as the totality of forms of knowing how to live and their super egoistic capacities. It leads to the liquidation of that through which the pretensions of psychosocial individuation are collectively projected, those works of the mind or spirit that open onto consistencies that stretch it out and animate it as lines of flights of immanence through which we can and must believe in this world. Marcuse does not see this clearly, even though he recognized that control is being taken of identification, and the result is disidentification, on the basis of which the Antigone complex can only continue to develop and do so in all manners of sociopathological forms, as well as frequently in the form of psychotic symptoms for psychic individuals, as can be seen in Japan with the otaku and the hikikomori, right? And I don't, you have to look at the footnote for that one. I don't have the reference ready to hand. And then he goes through the next part of the thing. Yeah, go ahead, Carl, yeah.
Are the people who have, in Japanese term for people who have totally withdrawn from society and will stay in their houses or in their rooms all day.
Okay, yeah.
People who are, who have a more human relationship with computers than they do with the rest of society. So,
okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, like kind of what we were going through with COVID quarantine, huh?
This was way before, because this was common back when he was writing this.
Yeah.
It seems, Michael, would you say, like, would it be fair to say, I mean, it seems like where he is, in some sense, moving beyond Marcuse is talking about the automatization of the superego, and it seems like what he's really arguing is almost we've passed to the point of its liquidation, but not just at the level of the individual, but sort of at the level of, I think, what he calls collective individuation, right? But which,
again, you have to see it in the relations between psychic, collective, and technical. All these 3 things are always already operative in Stiegler's thinking. Think of it that way. Yeah, always. Yeah. The psychic situation is not possible without the collective, and the 2 are not possible without the technical in terms of processes of what he ultimately will call trans-individuation, or what Simondon calls trans-individuation, that he takes up. And, and even in Althuserian, I mean, he's gone, he's a kind of wayward son of Althusser. Balibar, trans-individuation too, has many concepts that way that are coming out of that term. Yeah. So, but go ahead. I'm listening, Carl. I mean, it's a good.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to, think this, and again, I'm not trying to, I'm curious what other people think, but the kind of, it seems like the collective, and what he talks about earlier is the we and the spirit. And he actually talks about, this decomposition of sort of any stable reference point, shared meaning, shared values, the notion of a common good. That seemed like, it seems like he's talking about, it's a very interesting way of getting at what's happened with social media, perhaps, which is, he's actually writing this before the explosion of social media, but, what is, because like everything is now mnemonic, everything has been externalized onto the, these external technologies, right? We can Google anything. And, we don't have to remember shit anymore, just go Google it, right?
Well, I
And
mean, that's part of this emotion.
but at the same
Retention and hyponemata, right? This is part of the
Right,
project. The project, in a certain way, is a very difficult project because it forces us to recollect once again and to actively recollect in terms of thinking care. Yes, he has terms for this.
Yes.
And how do you negotiate that into the future? I mean, this is a radical repositioning, if you will, of thinking through what is memory and time, right? And what does this really mean? And he's raising very serious questions here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it seems to me that, like, both in this work and Technics and Time, he talks about, it was the passage you just read, that the problem is everything is being dominated to a return on financial investments, commercial imperatives, capitalist imperatives, and that seems to be ultimately where he comes down, that this is the danger we're facing.
Well, let's just look at our recent history. 2008, we're facing a major financial meltdown, right? It begins with Bear Stearns and the Cowboys there, right? And then it translates into Lehman Brothers, what was the name of that credit company? Countrywide Mortgage or whatever, I forgot the name of it.
Financial.
Yeah, financial. Anyway, all of these things begin to collapse. What happens during this period? Is there any kind of stock taking? No. The left is rejoicing. Look at what capitalism does. Here's the new set of victims of, collateralized debt obligations, collateralized mortgage obligations, credit default swaps, all of these new financial projects. What happens? We have gone through a period now from March of 2009, until today, of quantitative easing, trillions of dollars, new forms of capitalization out there. We have gone from the invention of cryptocurrencies, right, to what's called special project acquisition companies that have no future really, but capital goes towards them. All kinds of new laundering techniques, etc. So this is where we are. So yes, of course, this is what it's doing. Now, does this have anything to do with, libidinal industry, energy, right? Ultimately, I mean, Freud used to say, why gold that, money is, Ferenczi said this, is sublimated shit, right? In a way, on the ontogenesis of money in the psychoanalytic tradition, right? In a way. And what is this drive really about? And he says, children playing with their feces, right? Yeah, is part of the moment here, right? For the psychoanalytic.
One thing that just popped to my mind is, that I think kind of relates to this is that, thinking of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which, without getting, into they're basically they're completely fictitious. They're bullshit. They represent nothing, and it's what?
They're not bullshit. That's the problem.
No.
Level of abstraction that we don't understand yet because it goes back into the economy in different ways. Your hair, the coiffure in Midtown Manhattan may be the result of money laundering from a Bitcoin operation. Maybe part of a arms deal in the Ukraine. You never know. So I mean, this is something we should not do.
I know, but
it's all being held up by criminal enterprise. enterprises.
A lot of it. Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of money laundering, but that's just to refer to that there's
But it's not
something.
only money laundering, it's creating a whole new level of abstraction in capital. Marx saw this in volume 3, chapters 25 through 27, when he talks about fictitious capital. He defines it. It has no relationship to production. It, has no real existence in terms of, the real economy. But we're living very much in a virtual economy right now. I mean,
Well,
the real economy is
well,
still there.
I have actually
Near the cannon,
somewhat different.
you get hit in the head by an oil pipeline, and then it cracks your skull. Yes, it's real, the real economy. Yes, of course. But at the same time, there is this huge disconnect that is going on that is creating enormous senses that we have to think about what is value in terms of economic value today, and what kind of drive is producing this. That's another thing. Yeah. And I mean,
Well, just I have a different take on cryptocurrencies. I mean, there's the underlying technology which is being used by a lot of financial institutions and central banks now. And then there's actually what we call cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are neither money, they're not money, nor are they an asset. And in some ways, like, a capitalist used to become rich by actually going out and building an industry or developing a factory and producing things, right? And today, capitalists can become rich by basically producing artifacts that are entirely fictitious. There's nothing.
What does that tell you about Stiegler and his notion?
Well, it seems like, I mean, I was just relating to sort of like this kind of decomposition. I mean, I guess I was just thinking, I forget exactly what the connection was, but that there used to be sort of a more coherent project, right? You were actually, there was a notion of development and sort of, the capitalist ego, right, as sort of this monumental creation of worlds. And I don't even know that that's even really operative in the same way anymore.
Well, we don't know, but I just want to say, there are many of us, that may be subject to pension funds or whatever. When you look at exchange trading funds and other things like this, that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and others have Coinbase as a trading place, and Ethereum, et cetera. And I certainly recommend Ethereum over Bitcoin over the long haul. But anyway, you begin to see that this is much more than just a little game of crypto money laundering. It also is a game that many assets of teachers' unions, right? California retirees packages are all going into. Whether they will break is another story, but it is part of a new moment in capital, right? That comes out of the derivative markets that we still have a hard time deciphering, right? In many ways, yeah. So yeah. So I mean, I agree with you in some senses. It has no attempt to make widgets, as you were presenting, Carl. There's nothing about manufacturing here at all, right? This is financialization of everyday life, right? That's happening. And now it may be the binationalization of everyday life. Like this guy, Binance is the new term, right? So again, this is creating all these neologisms that are coming out of, I mean, I won't use Wall Street, out of international financial circles, right? That Stiegler is beginning can see as part of this technics, right? That happens, right? There are levels of, they need to become confronted. He's not advocating for it, but I think he has a better ability to understand this, right? As part of, a massive diversion of libido, right? Into, our drives about accumulation, right? In a sense, right? I mean, I think this is very complex. I don't think we have answers, right?
Well, no, this is interesting.
Weapons to understand, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is interesting. I mean, I guess like what I'm thinking, like I think that you could make an argument that cryptocurrency is really the monetization of a very sophisticated computer game played by, people who have never matured, right, but have very high aptitudes to do certain things. Because really what it is it's like you solve the puzzle, you get a little reward, you get a cookie, and then you keep solving more puzzles and you get more cookies. And eventually you become rich. This is an infantile endeavor. And I think that does actually fit.
You don't think the educational institutions at this point are infantile endeavors?
Oh
Or,
yeah, no, I'm saying like, but that's kind of like what we're being dominated. And it seems like this is kind of what he's getting at in some sense, is that this is sort of like the dissolution of the superego, and it seems like there is a relation here. I'm not quite sure what it is. But.
Yeah, no, there is this. I mean, he's very well aware of the infantilization of everyday life. Yes, he's
Right.
very well aware of this. That's why he's really trying to put out, the passage I read about temporality, where he said, this is not about progress, the structural and the historical, right? He's really talking about, look, you can have a Dadaist moment in the 30s or the 20s, you can have a Weimar explosion and some Dadaism, before that, and you can have it maybe repeated in a different way, a kind of eternal recurrence of the same, if you want to speak like Nietzsche or Blanquet, who invented the term while in jail, if you want to see it that way. But he's really looking at this, yes, in terms of, yes, these things have the capacity to repeat themselves, right? And he's looking for that new opening where we could have this, not May of '68, but something better that's really up to date. So yeah, of course he's going to coin neologisms. He is really expert at this, right? There's a whole new vocabulary developing here, but I hope appropriate or adequate to the phenomena that he's describing. That's the point here, right? In some way.
Yeah.
And he is taking this Heideggerian moment very seriously of the return to the pre-Socratics, right? In terms of becoming, especially with Heraclitus, right? And this tragic sense. What infantilization is, it's a denial of the tragic in many ways, the tragic sense of life, right? The privileging of thanatos, right? In a way, the tragic sense of life, we all die. Right, we forget this, right? In a sense, and in a way, I mean, I think he's really on to something here. And one of his arguments about Marcuse is Marcuse doesn't understand this so much about reality, this relationship between reality and pleasure. Why is it some people are much more hyper at funerals and weddings, if you will, right, than they are in everyday life? I mean, what does the funeral thing bring out libidinally, right? In a way. Think about this, really, in a sense, right? It's very, very interesting.
Michael, I have a quick question.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Just thinking about these relationships. I hope you don't have a cough.
I do have a cough, but it's not COVID.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, you never know these days.
Yeah, you never know these days. Yeah.
I'm always just So I'm a hypochondriac, so that's professional hypochondriac. No, I was just thinking through these issues of what you said earlier about the community of care and so on. And it reminds me of Marcuse. I mean, I'm thinking through Marcuse's approach about 68 and the idea of individuation, which seems to be more his focus than a community. Although in One Dimensional Man, I think in his last book, also on aesthetics, he does, I think, create the possibility of a community based on refusal. This idea that as a group, we must refuse what's in front of us if desublimation doesn't work. So I guess my question is, does Marcuse also have a concept of community in this sense? And also, secondly, I'm very interested in the fact that Stiegler, towards the end of his life, started this philosophy center where he was living.
Southern France, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that would be another way in which philosophy could provide a kind of nexus or a community framework as well. I find that very fascinating. So,
we welcome you in the Greek island of Kossos this summer if you want to make it.
I saw that. I did see that. It's very tempting.
For 2
Get
weeks.
the wife's permission.
We're supposed to do desire and libido, and one of the participants is very good on surplus and
I did see this. I'm going to be.
We get to drink and eat well and, philosophize, swim. It's really, we're actually the idyllic moment of the economic philosophical manuscripts of 1844. I guess that's part of it.
What's this, Michael? I haven't heard about this. What is?
I don't
I
think
received the email.
I don't think he ever really framed a community. I think the politics was much more that of the Great Refusal. And he was looking for revolutionary agents. The revolutionary agents, if you will, or subjects were really that of, the somewhat to the feminist movement, but mainly the students of the world, and in connection with third world struggles. He did not have any real faith in labor unions and the working class in the United States, even though he was admiring of it. And, Stanley Aronowitz was certainly one of the people Marcuse liked a lot, because Stanley could educate him about the American working class. Both Arendt and Marcuse liked Stanley for that very reason, right? He was one of the pipelines, if you will, to, the American working class because of false promises, etc. But in terms of really the thinking of a community, no. I mean, Marcuse was retired. I mean, I know a little bit about his life. He was retired from University of California at San Diego early, earlier than he should have been. But he stayed there, and he had classes at his house, right? And people would go there. So it was a community of scholars, right? In many ways, right? Yeah. So I don't think he really had that notion. His politics was the Great Refusal, that you would not participate in the performance principle. And in my own life, I adhered to that. I was very good at playing poker, and I just said, this is too capital, et cetera. I got away from that notion because I was a true believer, if you will, or, thought it was a real sellout in a way, because the Great Refusal is about not participating in this performance principle, which is, surplus repression to him, right? In many ways. So, yeah. So that was his politics, right? And writing. And one of his most interesting essays that's come up now, and for those of you that probably follow this or know a little bit of the chatter on social media, is this critique of repressive tolerance that he wrote in 1965 with a postscript in 68. And this was a reading of John Stuart Mill's On Toleration, but Marcuse actually made it very contemporary. And Matt Taibbi went against him, and Peter Bratsis and I, went after Matt Taibbi in a program called Who's Afraid of Herbert Marcuse, based on this and how stupid Taibbi was to go after Marcuse. Anyway, and now Kristen Parenti has joined the chorus, and now I hear the FBI, an ex-FBI agent, is going after Sartre, as part of the.
Is Matt Taibbi, is that the same person that's the journalist?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, because I heard him speak about the
culture, and he's a precursor of identity politics, and he's a part of the problem for all our woes in the educational institutions.
Okay, because I heard him speak on the radio recently about the elite media, and I thought he had no idea what he was talking about.
Well, I can agree with that too.
Okay.
I saw
his actual
going back to your question, I mean, what Stiegler is really trying to do here is saying, look, this isn't enough, right? We need a different kind of weaponry, right? This is what he's saying. With all due respect, I mean, Marcuse's, was great. I mean, no question about it. And as you say, he tries to sketch. I think the aesthetic dimension is a sketch. One Dimensional Man was the most read book, I think, of its period. I mean, huge. But after you read Heidegger, you see it's, it's second tier Heideggerianism in a certain level, right? But, very politically charged in a different way. And Eros and Civilization, and of course, earlier books. I mean, he began with the concept of historicity in Hegel. This was his dissertation in Germany. And then he went Reason and Revolution on Hegel and social theory, right? 1941, when he's trying to save Hegel, from appropriation by the Nazis, right? that it was a rereading of the real is the rational, and the rational is the real, right? And in many ways. So a very great book, note on dialectic, phenomenal on what the dialectic is. A very good, introduction to dialectics, much better than plowing through hundreds of pages of other people that write about it. It's very precise and clear. So I'm not saying that there's something, and not to read Eros and Civilization. In fact, I don't have my copy of Eros and Civilization here in -5, Montreal, but I wish I did. But anyway,
Yeah, I think my only point here I would add, just a gloss, is I
Yes.
mean, the 68. I think I don't live in France, but I'm aware that there's nothing really comparable, I don't think, in our culture here that matches the fervor that has continued in terms of rethinking 68. We don't really have anything comparable when we think of the 60s in the United States. It was focused on Vietnam. The Vietnam War ended, and the hippies became brokerage house managers or whatever they did. And this continuation of thought and reevaluation of 68 in France is put Stiegler, I think, aligned with many other people like Alain Badiou, particularly I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
But I also think it's really interesting for him to use Marcuse as the kind of nexus point, because I do think it obviously points to his continuing validity, the importance that he stands for, not because he had solutions, but because he does touch so deeply in every sector of these kinds of questions.
I'm in agreement with you. Yeah. I mean, in a way, remember, Stiegler is also coming out of the Derridian moment, the project of the pharmacon, the project of the différance, and he's trying to think these things very differently than we've been accustomed to learning them through just the Frankfurt School, if you will, or other, very creative thinkers around this. I mean, I very deeply admire and reread it at times Norman O. Brown's book on Freud, a philosophical inquiry into, Marcuse's philosophical inquiry into Freud. I think psychoanalytic interpretation of history was Marcuse's, Norman O. Brown, his friend. They worked together at the OSS. They both were decoders. Norman O. Brown's first book was a code for stealth technology. Hermes,
Mhm.
Hermes is Thief.
Yeah.
Book. It's a very good.
Douglas, one of the things
Anyway,
also just,
yeah.
I was just thinking about what Douglas was saying, and one of the things just I think that part of the affinity Stiegler may feel towards Marcuse is that I just sense, like, in a personal way, they're both very there's a sincerity that sometimes I think is missing in certain, like in Foucault, perhaps, or I feel like kind of what you're talking about, Douglas, of this attempt to touch deeply, and this sort of deep concern with.
Well, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I think we all are, especially people living in New York, because of the pandemic and what it's wrought, and the need, perhaps my feeling, and this goes into my own personal philosophy, that in the wake of government failures and state intervention failures from the state to intervene successfully, are we able to create new forms of organization that do not depend upon established institutional structures? And I think this organization here, this collective here, is actually one of those things. And I'm very interested in how that could be taken forward. And I've been reading a lot about anarchism, which is not something that I was much more aware of Marxism and Marxist thinking. So even anarchism is a kind of ways of creating new organizations, Chomsky and so on. Now, Stiegler, I don't know what his link is, if anything, to anarchism, or whether he even had anything to say on that. But certainly these ideas of community outside of the state. And I'm wondering in France if that would be very unusual, because in France, there's a very different relationship between the individual and the state, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I just want to back up for a second. I mean, I have a kind of idea of probably part of what really happened here versus that in what France, or why there's some. First of all, France intellectuals are like movie stars, right? They're status of movie stars. You know, everybody knows who Jean-Paul Sartre had 500,000 people at his funeral marching down the street. Yves Montand crying in the first row. Simone Signoret was his student when she was in high school in the 30s, right? So these relations, Julia Greco, they hung with the movie stars. You don't have any of this. Nobody I know is hanging with
Apart from you, though, Michael. Apart from you.
Exactly. Anyway, so all to say, so there's a very different relationship to the educational system, which is diminished. It's not the same as it was, in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, or really even the 90s for that matter. It's changed radically, but it still has this force of an intellectual culture that you can pick up Le Monde Diplomatique, and you read, profound thinking, right? It's not like a New York Times op-ed or the Guardian's weekly, thing or summary, right? In a sense. So there's a very different, culture about the intellectual, the pantheon, all of this. So that's one thing. In the United States, unfortunately, this is a very depoliticized and often apoliticized, country in a way, because of the notion of individualism, which doesn't exist at all, but people think it does, right? In many ways. And, if you really look at the political situation of 68, there was the Chicago Convention here. There was the formation of factions in SDS. There were many things that were occurring around that and the anti-war movements. Part of the problem is there was a faith in the Democratic Party, but to me, politically, after the Great Society, which put into some price, Lyndon Johnson was the second best or maybe even the first best domestic president of the 20th century. He got through civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, Medicare, Medicaid, affirmative action. These are pretty big moments, right? All being undone, as we know, actively today, right? Social Security, et cetera. So anyway, going back to this, the failure of the Democrats to really take a stand, right, on the war and other things, 68, I think was the end of any semblance of electoral politics. Not that I ever believed in it, but any possibility. What people have held on to in the United States is that somehow, Walter Mondale might make it better. Michael Dukakis, right? Bill Clinton. I mean, et cetera. Hillary Clinton, right? Barack Obama. All of these moments are completely, and look at Biden. What Biden is doing is paving the way for the even more extreme right resurgence. Takeover. So really, in a sense, unless we think this through at that level, we're really missing something, right? And in a way, right? And so. This is the problem in the United States, and we don't read stuff like this, on a daily basis or discuss it. We don't really talk about this, right? We have books that are about Disneyland and Fantasyland and, good journalistic approaches, but theoretically, we're not doing anything, here. There's a good book. I looked at it on, austerity that just came out, a kind of history of why austerity fails, right, in political economy. There are always some good.
Well,
They're descriptive and analytical. They're never really a critical force that opens up some kind of new theoretical, epistemological or theoretical paradigm shift. And I think Stiegler is trying to do this. This is what he's really about, right? He's really trying to shift the thinking and the ground from underneath us. And to my mind, you mentioned Badiou, and I've read a lot about you, et cetera. To me, Stiegler has a deeper sense of, I think, this otium, the care, right, is really there. You can feel it. This is a guy that was in jail for 5 years. This was a guy that, ran, was in business, right? And, from a different part of Paris, et cetera. Did not go through the straight to the Sorbonne, becoming part of the teaching apparatus. He earned it in a very different way. So I think there's something to be said for this, in terms of, I'm in Nietzsche, sometimes philosophy is the confession of the author, right? In some ways, in a sense, or the long, autobiographical, sense. And I don't mean in the traditional sense. Yeah.
Well, sorry. Oh.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say really quickly, we don't have theory in the United States that's
Well, one of the
respected by
things-
the people, but we do have, if you go back to the cinema, we do have the thinking of apocalypse. So what is America given in terms of cinematic reality? It's in the image of apocalypse. And that may be our greatest contribution in the last 20 years, is this cinematic type of experience.
Yeah, however, I mean, it was the Koreans who did Parasite.
That's true. Well, one Korean, yeah.
Think about this, or is Parasite on the Hollywood drawing board? No. And if you really look at global, and I suggest people really interested in cinema, what's going on globally, subscribe to Mubi. It's not that expensive, MUBI. It gives you a really global sense of what's going on in other countries, right? And at this point, I mean, the best we're going to get this year is Don't Look Up, right?
Yeah. Well, what I mean is, I'm not saying that's a indication of the power of cinema itself in America, because a lot of these movies are quite bad. But I think it touches upon a zeitgeist in the American cultural vein, and also the religious apocalypticism that is America. It's in the fabric of America. It's this idea of disaster that cinema has captured, I would say, in America. And that is our philosophy, I suppose, in a cinematic kind of way. And I think that many people, like I was in Taiwan for a conference once, and a professor in Taiwan, but who's from America, said it's very hard. When I teach cinema to my students in Taiwan, they just seem very naive and innocent from an American standpoint. They're not so inured in this feeling of constant apocalypse, which is our bread and butter. If you watch TV, Walking Dead, all of these films about the end of the world. And I think that's what Americans are prepared for. It's a millenarianism, perhaps, this outcropping of religious zeal.
Ukraine right now, or you're living in Kazakhstan, or you're living in, basically in, the West Bank, you're Palestinian, and, et cetera. You're living this in a daily reality, right?
Yeah.
Of which, a kind of, yeah. So we're really a far, far away. The eschatology and certainly the apocalyptic nature of American cinema and the blockbuster that deals with that. Yes, of course, that's pervades the consciousness, just like NFL football does, in
Right.
terms of everyday life. But on the other hand, the reality is much stranger than this stuff in terms of everyday life for a lot of people, and we're really guarded against that. But you're right. I mean, we're very lacking in theory. And I want to go back to what you said about anarchism and all this. In the 1860s, when the IWW and the movement was really getting together, Marx, Bakunin, and Proudhon, they united. They knew they had differences and schisms, but they were together. They said, we have one enemy in common, and they knew who that enemy was. Even though one went the way of guild socialism, the other went the way of anarchism, and the other went the way of, kind of a, communist, it became social democracy in the hands of Engels later on, but anyway, all to say, this is important to keep in mind. Do we really have that today? We have all these schisms on the left, right? Still, all the time. You're either Marxist-Leninist, you have a Stalinist edge, you have a Trotskyist edge, right? All of these tendencies still play out in a sense, and there's not a unity of consciousness in a sense. There's not this collective individuation that understands the technical individuation alongside it. And this to me is where Stiegler is important. He may not be a Marxist, literally purist, right? He's not certainly, in a way, he may be a Derridian, practitioner. He has issues with Derrida too. It's not like he spares anybody, right? Going forward, which is good in a way. He's into polemics. And that's another thing that I see in the United States, being an academic, in a way, you always have to go with civility. I agree to disagree, Yeah, the stupidity. The polemics have been eliminated from academic discourse. And what it becomes in polemics is social media. Chomsky's a fascist because he says certain things about you have to get vaccinated, or, and he has trust in the medical system. This is the level that we're getting now at this point.
Yeah.
So this is again part of the problem, and to my mind a symptom of what's going on. And that really, in a way, what Stiegler is performing, in my opinion, is a good symptomatic critical reading of Marcuse, its limitation, where it may be wrong, right, in this chapter, in a sense. And he's trying to offer some way, a pointing of a way out, in a sense. And really, can we get out of this thinking about guilt and the family and going, into another level of really getting on with things? And I think this is important, right?
Yeah.
And,
One of the things I was, Michael, just to when you
sure.
said, like, he's sort of looking for a new framework, and I like what he's, I like his project. Maybe we can talk about this more, next week, but I'm not convinced about the framework he's laying out. I find his notion of technics, it seems like it's kind of an overburdened concept, and I think that, to me, he's going too far away from, I think, some of the more traditional concepts in Marx about political economy, and it seems, which is not necessarily a critique, but I don't know that he's ultimately able to complete the agenda he set out for himself.
Right.
in some
I,
sense.
I
That-
suggest,
that-
the discussion would be better if you and I mean, I've read the critique of for a new critique of political economy, which is quote, sketch of where he wants to go, in terms of new concepts, right? Versus that of the Marxist paradigm, right, in a way, while again, with deep respect for Marx, right, in this sense, right? And then we can have that discussion, because a lot of critique of him is that he is not a Marxist, right? And they don't like it, exactly what you're saying. But I think it's important to read him, in terms of what he's doing first. That's all I'm saying, to give him a hearing.
Oh yeah. Well, we could
This
talk about.
notion of libidinal economy and the economy of libido and the economy of the drives is very important. The tendency of the libido to exhaust itself, right? Kind of, sense. So it's really going on today in all kinds of phases. You see it. I mean, Douglas was just referring to the pandemic and then what we're going through in New York City and what I go through in Montreal. I mean, there's a curfew. I can't go outside. I can be arrested. I can be fined $6,000. Yeah. I can't go. You can't even walk the dog right after this hours. You have to be, essential worker, whatever that means, right? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting because, what you were saying earlier about, all this factionalism within the left. And, I think that in some sense, intellectual life, there's a similar process, is that everything has become so differentiated and eclectic in some sense that I think we don't have a set of, kind of common principles that we start with. And, or a sense of like a basic understanding of this is kind of the reality we live in and what we're fighting against, and then building upon that, right? And trying to develop theory. Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a long discussion.
Well, let me mention two things, and then we can close. I mean, I know it's getting late. I mean, I'm okay, but I feel for you guys.
I need to eat. I
Anyway.
need dinner.
Yeah.
Dinner.
Let me just mention a couple of things, and we can go back to this next week, but I will, I want to go over cinematic consciousness as well, make some, connections if we can. And then maybe if you have the Kittler, maybe start reading what I put out as a possibility for next week, especially his theoretical presuppositions. These are really, I mean, look, again, one of the reasons I think that these are good groups is that we're really engaged with very profound thinkers who are very careful in what they're doing. This is not descriptive analytical work. This is theoretical work. it's a process, it's a crafting, and something going on. So I want us to keep this in mind. So the Kittler is a very different approach to this techniques, but you'll see, and we can actually maybe draw some similarities. But let me just say a couple of things. So one of the other crucial aspects here is this section on the reading of Totem and Taboo, section 7, Freud's famous Totem and Taboo, which sort of sets up the automation of the superego, or the development of guilt in the superego, the murder of the father and the opening of time, guilt, and the instance of my death, henceforth always pending, is his chapter, right? Which is kind of good. And I suggest reading that. If you know Totem and Taboo and the story there, he actually has a very, and again, Carl and Douglas, the notion of community here for Stiegler is milieu. He's going to use milieu as a term instead of community, a milieu of care, a milieu of appropriation. So anyway, the passage of desire, this is page 61, is defined here by guilt, and the latter is the result of a weapon, which is to say, of a use of technics. I have argued elsewhere, and this may give you a different thing than about Marx and Stiegler here, Carl. I have argued elsewhere that the whole problem lies in the presumption that technics existed prior to the murder. Freud wonders how the son found the courage to take action and suggests it may have been command over some new weapon, right? This is, you know the story of the primal father, right? In Totem and Taboo, He does not see that to presume that the weapon existed before the murder is a serious problem, right? It is precisely this repression of technics, and he uses this notion, repression of techniques, however, that lies at the origin of this obsession with guilt. And this is what neither Marcuse nor Freud managed to think. The sons must precede the constitution of the sons, insofar as the sons are constituted as sons as killing the father. That's their identification, right? Right? And the father is himself only constituted as the father after the event, and insofar as he returns as a ghost. The dead father is more powerful than the live father. This implies that he was already there as a father before his constitution as father, unless indeed his image is only formed on the condition of producing, through his murder, the illusion or the simulacrum of his existence before the murder. Such an illusion, however, would involve the same false problem of knowing what comes first in the hylomorphic scheme, form or matter, the chicken or the egg. Simondon's answer is clear. Neither one nor the other, neither form nor matter. So we go from the both and thinking to neither nor, right? This is interesting, right? Yeah, neither structural principle, formal or material, depending on which one is an idealist or materialist, nor historical principle. It's not a matter of thinking that this or that tendency or principle precedes something else. How do we get out of this? What comes first? Rather, it is a matter of thinking the differentiation, very important, of a potential in two tendencies in the course of a process through which a pre-individual milieu, supersaturated with potential, individuates itself. And in this case, there is a potential supersaturated by the fact that life, that is, vital individuation, projects it through itself through technical exteriorization. This is why Marcuse goes astray in wanting to identify a structural reality principle before the historical reality principle, which in any case he never manages to do. We are unable to discover by reading Eros and Civilization what the structural reality principle could possibly be. He fails to grasp that technics, far from being the principle of a fall and a very long downward spiral, is the process through which desire is constituted as the default of origin. That is, the process constitutively causing the default of the desired object. It is not the fault through which desire was diverted from its nature. And then he goes on to the two myths, right? The Greek tradition, as I've recalled and relying on the works of great classicists, by the way, worth reading, Jean-Pierre Vernat, is tragic to and Technics constitute the fabric onto which the motives of eidos and dike came to be projected. Eidos and dike do not themselves exist, but bring about the collective